All right, hope everybody is well. Coming to you right off of the heels of the Symbolic World Summit, which was a really beautiful, wonderful, and special event. I'm going to do a debrief video, maybe with some special guests here. But what I wanted to do today is I wanted to read from Alexander Schmemann's For the Life of the World. At the end, there's an appendix, and the title of this essay is called Sacrament and Symbol. And if you're into symbolism, a la Jonathan Peugeot, I highly suggest reading this article at the end of this book here. It gives you a great insight into the kind of patristic nexus of what Jonathan is talking about, the patristic origins of the concept. So I'm going to read a little bit here. Maybe I'll do two parts, and let me know what you guys think. And here we go. So, Sacrament and the Symbol. The initial difficulty encountered by an Orthodox when he speaks of sacraments lies in the necessity to choose between the various strata of his own theological tradition. If he opts for the more recent and official, quote, theology of manuals, which developed in Orthodox theological schools since the 16th century, his presentation will undoubtedly be quite similar in terminology as well as in content to any Latin de sacramentis. From a general definition of sacraments as, quote, visible means of invisible grace, he will proceed to the distinction in them between form and matter, their institution by Christ, their numbering and classification, and finally their proper administration as condition of their validity and efficacy. It is in fact, however, which is recognized today by a growing number of Orthodox theologians, that this approach to sacraments, although accepted and taught for several centuries, has very little to do with the genuine tradition of the Eastern Church. It is seen rather as one of the most unfortunate results and expressions of the, quote, pseudomorphosis suffered by Orthodox theology after the breakdown of the patristic age, when tragic conditions of ecclesiastical life forced upon Orthodox, quote-unquote, intellectuals a non-critical adoption of Western theological categories and thought forms. The result was a deeply westernized theology whose tradition was maintained, and to some extent still maintained, by theological schools. In Russia, for example, theology was taught in Latin until the 40s of the 19th century. The Western captivity, quote-unquote, of Orthodox theology has been vigorously denounced by the best theologians of the last 100 years, and there exists today a significant movement aimed at the recovery of our theology of its own genuine perspective and method. Enter Jonathan Peugeot. So what we're getting at here is the westernization of the concept of the sacraments, and we're going to get into in symbolism that occurred the last few hundred years, and coming out of that to get a more originary understanding of what is meant by symbolic sacraments. The return to the fathers, to the liturgical and spiritual traditions which were virtually ignored by the theology of manuals, is beginning to bear fruit. The process, however, is still in its initial stage, and as to sacramental theology, very little has been achieved, which means that any effort of recovery and reconstruction here is of necessity a tentative and preliminary one. The urgent task is precisely to recover a perspective, to raise questions which, within the antiquated frameworks of quote-unquote manuals, not only were not answered, but could not have been formulated. Let me know what you guys think, if you were tracking and if this is resonating. I continue on. What is sacrament? In answering this question, the post-patristic Western and Westernizing theology places itself within a mental context deeply, if not radically, different from that of the early church. I say mental and not intellectual because the difference belongs here to a level much deeper than one of intellectual presuppositions or theological terminology. Patristic theology, to be sure, was not less quote-unquote intellectual than scholasticism, and as to terminology, it is precisely its unbroken continuity, the use of the same words, however altered in their meaning, that may have concealed from too many historians of theology of discontinuity between the two types of sacramental theology. Externally or formally, this change This change consisted, first of all, in a new approach by sacramental theology to the very object of its study. In the early church and the writings of the fathers, sacraments, inasmuch as they are given any systematic interpretation, are always explained in the context of their liturgical celebration, the explanation being, in fact, an exegesis of the liturgy itself in all its ritual complexity and concreteness. So the Father's interpretation of the sacrament is always already embedded in the work of the people, the liturgy. The medieval De Sacramentis, however, tends from its very inception to isolate the quote-unquote sacrament from its liturgical context, to find and to define in terms as precise as possible its essence, i.e., that which distinguishes it from the non-sacrament. Sacrament, in a way, begins to be opposed to liturgy. It has, of course, its ritual expression, its signum, which belongs to its essence, but this sign is viewed now as ontologically different from all other signs, symbols, and rites of the Church. And because of this difference, the precise sacramental sign alone is considered, to the exclusion of all other liturgy, the proper object of theological attention. One can, for example, read and reread the elaborate treatment given in St. Thomas' Summa to sacraments without yet knowing much about their liturgical celebration. And one can scrutinize virtually all Catholic and Orthodox treatises of holy orders without seeing mentioned, be it only once, the traditional and organic connection between the ordination and the Eucharist. To historians of theology, this change is due to what they describe as the progress of, quote, scientific theology and the growth of a more precise theological method. In reality, however, this change, far from being a mere external one, has its roots in a deep transformation of theological vision, indeed, of the entire theological, quote-unquote, world view. And it is this nature of the transformation that we must try to understand in the first place if we want to reach initial meaning of the sacrament. So we need to have an understanding of this theological paradigmatic shift. He continues, to simplify our task, we can take as the starting point of this study the long and well-known debate which dominates from beginning to end the development in the West of sacramental and more especially Eucharistic theology. It is the debate on the real presence. Nowhere indeed is better revealed the line dividing from one another to two approaches to the sacrament, as well as to the reasons which led to the transformation of one into the other. Within the context of that debate, the term real clearly implies the possibility of another type of presence which therefore is not real. The term for the other presence in the Western intellectual theological idiom is, we know, symbolical. So this is the first dichotomy where the symbolic is being juxtaposed to the real, right? So you're already seeing this schism, this rift happen between the symbolical nature of the sacraments and the sacraments themselves. We need not go into the very complex and in many ways confused history of that term in Western thought, symbolism. It is clearly that in the common theological language as it takes shape between the Carolingian Renaissance and the Reformation, and in spite of all controversies between rival theological schools, the, quote, incompatibility between symbol and reality, between figura et veritas, is constantly affirmed and accepted. To the mystic non vere, the mystic non true, corresponds not less exclusively vere non mystique, true, not mystical. The fathers and the whole early tradition, however, and we reach here the crux of the matter, not only do not know this distinction and opposition, but to them symbolism is the essential dimension of the sacrament, the proper key to understanding. I'm going to read that again. The fathers and the whole early tradition, however, and here we reach the crux of the matter, not only do not know of this distinction and opposition, but to them symbolism is the essential dimension of the sacrament, the proper key to its understanding. St. Maximus the Confessor, the sacramental theologian par excellence of the patristic age, calls the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharistic symbols, symbola, images, and mysteries. Symbolical here is not only not opposed to real, but embodies it as its very expression and mode of manifestation. Again, symbolical here, according to St. Maximus, is not only not opposed to the real, but embodies it as its very expression and mode of manifestation. Historians of theology, in their ardent desire to maintain the myth of theological continuity and orderly quote-unquote evolution, here again find their explanation in the imprecision of patristic terminology. They do not seem to realize that the Father's use of symbolon and related terms is not vague or imprecise, but simply different from that of the later theologians, and that the subsequent transformation of these terms constitutes indeed the source of one of the greatest theological tragedies. The difference here is primarily a difference in the apprehension of reality itself, or, as we've said above, a difference of worldview. If for the Fathers, symbol is a key to sacrament, it is because sacrament is in continuity with the symbolical structure of the world, in which, quote, omnes creaturae sensibilis sunt signa rerum sacrum, and the world is symbolical. In virtue of its being created by God, to be symbolical belongs thus to its ontology, the symbol being not only the way to perceive and understand reality, a means of cognition, but also a means of participation. Sound familiar? It is then the, quote, natural symbolism of the world, one can almost say its sacramentality, that makes the sacrament possible and constitutes the key to its understanding and apprehension. If the Christian sacrament is unique, it is not in the sense of being a miraculous exception to the natural order of things created by God and, quote, proclaiming his glory. Its absolute newness is not in its ontology as sacrament, but its specific res, quote-unquote res, which it symbolizes, i.e. reveals, manifests, and communicates, which is Christ and his kingdom. But even this absolute newness is to be understood in terms of not of total discontinuity, but in those of fulfillment. The quote-unquote mysterion of Christ reveals and fulfills the ultimate meaning and destiny of the world itself. Therefore, the institution of sacraments by Christ, a theme which will obsess the later theology, is not the creation ex nihilo of the sacramentality itself, of the sacrament as means of cognition and participation. In the words of Christ, quote, do this in remembrance of me. The this, meal, thanksgiving, breaking of bread, is already sacramental. The institution means that by being referred to Christ, quote, filled with Christ, the symbol is fulfilled and becomes sacrament. It is this continuity of the sacrament with symbol that the post-patristic theology begins first to minimize and then simply to reject, and it does this because of a progressive dissolution of the symbol, conditioned in turn by a new concept of theology in its relation to faith. The ultimate problem of all theology is that of knowledge, and more precisely of the possibility and nature of the knowledge of God. If the Fathers hold together in a living and truly existential synthesis, on the one hand, the absolute otherness of God, the impossibility for creatures to know him in his essence, and, on the other hand, the reality of man's communion with God, knowledge of God, and theosis, this synthesis is rooted primarily in their idea, or rather intuition, of the mysterion, and of its mode of presence and operation, the symbol. For it is the very nature of symbol that it reveals and communicates the other as precisely the other, the visibility of the invisible as invisible, the knowledge of the unknowable as unknowable, the presence of the future as future. The symbol is a means of knowledge of that which cannot be known otherwise, for knowledge here depends on participation, the living encounter with an entrance into that epiphany of reality which the symbol is. But then theology is not only related to the mysterion, but has in its source the condition of its very possibility. Theology as proper words and knowledge about God is the result of the knowledge of God, and in him of all reality. The, quote, original sin of post-patristic theology consists therefore in the reduction of the concept of knowledge to rational or discursive knowledge, or, in other terms, in the separation of knowledge from mysterion. This theology does not reject the symbolical worldview of the earlier tradition. The sentence quoted above is from Thomas Aquinas, but it radically changes the understanding of that signum. In the early tradition, and this is of paramount importance, the relationship between the sign in the symbol A and that which it signifies, B, is neither a merely semantic one, A means B, nor causal, A is the cause of B, nor representative, A represents B. We called this relationship an epiphany. A is B means that the whole of A expresses, communicates, reveals, manifests the reality of B, although not necessarily the whole of it, without, however, losing its own ontological reality, without being dissolved in another quote-unquote res. But it was precisely this relationship between the A and the B, between the sign and the signified, that was changed. Because of the reduction of knowledge to rational or discursive knowledge, there appears between A and B a hiatus. The symbol may still be a means of knowledge, but as all knowledge, it is knowledge about and not knowledge of. It can be a revelation about the res, but not the epiphany of the res itself. A can mean B, or represent it, or even in certain instances be the cause of its presence, but A is no longer viewed as the very means of participation in B. Knowledge and participation are now two different realities, two different orders. I hope this is making sense. I really love this. So maybe going to skip ahead here. I'll adjust it. I'll do a couple parts. So for sacramental theology, this dissolution of symbol had truly disastrous consequences. By changing the very notion of sacrament, it radically transformed also that of theology, provoking finally a crisis whose real scope and depth we are beginning to realize only today. It must be clear by now, we hope, that the theme of real presence, which we mentioned above and whose appearance in way inaugurated the post-patristic period in sacramental theology, was born out of theological doubt about the reality of symbol, i.e. its ability to contain and communicate reality. We've briefly explained the reasons for the doubt, the identification on the one hand of symbol with the means of knowledge, the reduction on the other hand of knowledge to rational and discursive knowledge about rather than of reality. And since tradition was unanimous in affirming the sacrament as verum, i.e. real, the question was bound to rise: how can the symbol be the vehicle or the mode of sacrament? Since, however, the patristic use of symbolical terminology in reference to sacraments was an equally obvious datum of the same tradition, the doubt was resolved at first by a mere reinforcement of one terminology, the symbolical, by another, the realistic. The sacrament is both, quote, figura et res, veritas et figura, in its non-solemn mystic sed etiam vere. But soon, and in virtue of a progressive devaluation of symbol made inevitable by its dissolution, the two terms had to be viewed as not only different, but, in fact, opposed to each other. In the famous case of Berenger of Toros, the remarkable fact is the complete identity in the understanding of the symbol between Berenger himself and those who condemned him. If for him the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist are not real because they are symbolical, for the Council of the Lateran of 1059, they are real precisely because they are not symbolical. The distinction having inevitably led to opposition, the latter has remained the fundamental framework of all subsequent theological development. There remained, however, the problem of the signum, whose relation to the res of the sacrament had to be defined in a new way. For if it is not a symbol, what is it? Post-patristic theology answered the question by defining signum as cause, and it is here that the notion and probably the experience of sacrament suffered its deepest transformation. In the early tradition, the causality inherent in the sacrament, the sanctification it procures for those who partake of it, is inseparable from its symbolism, for it is rooted in it. This in no way limits or contradicts the unique cause of all sacraments, their institution by Christ. For, as we have said already, the institution is precisely the fulfillment of a symbol by Christ and therefore its transformation into a sacrament. It is thus an act not of discontinuity, but of fulfillment and actualization. It is the epiphany in and through Christ of the quote-unquote new creation, not the creation of something new. And if it reveals the, quote, continuity between creation and Christ, it is because there exists at first a continuity between Christ and creation whose logos, life and light, he is. It is precisely this aspect of both the institution and sacrament that virtually disappears in post-patristic theology. The causality linking the institution to signum or to res is viewed as extrinsic and formal, not as intrinsic and revealing. Rather than revealing through fulfillment, it guarantees the reality of the sacrament's effect. Even as in the case of the Eucharist, the sign is completely identified with reality. It is experienced in terms of the sign's annihilation rather than in those of fulfillment. In this sense, the doctrine of transubstantiation, in its tridentine form, is truly the collapse, or rather the suicide, of sacramental theology. If this new understanding of causality as an extrinsic and formal guarantee breaks the ontological continuity between the sign and the res, it also rejects de facto all continuity between institution and the normal order of things. It is indeed this continuity that is now being stressed and affirmed. Considered as the causa principalis of the signum, as causa secunda, institution becomes now an absolute starting point of a sacramental system entirely sui generis. And the efforts by some recent theologians to bring back into the notion of signum the richness of traditional symbolism concern the accidents, not the substance, in the doctrine and understanding of sacraments. And I'll leave it with this last little section here. Maybe I'll do another part to finish it off. For doctrine and understanding are now very different from those of the early church. In the latter, sacrament was not only open to, it truly held together the three dimensions or levels of Christian vision of reality, those of the church, the world, and the kingdom. And, quote, holding them together is made them known in the deepest patristic sense of the word knowledge, as both understanding and participation. It was the source of theology, knowledge about God in his relation to the world, the church, and the kingdom, because it was knowledge of God and in him of all reality. Having its beginning, content, and the end in Christ, it is at the same time revealed Christ as the beginning, the content, and the end of all which exists as its creator, redeemer, and fulfillment. The transformation of the sacrament in post-patristic theology consisted, therefore, in its isolation within a self-contained and self-sufficient sacramental organism, quote-unquote organism. That external isolation of the sacrament from the liturgy, which we mentioned before, was indeed symbolical, quote-unquote, of a much deeper change, quote, the notion of the sacraments. A contemporary theologian writes enthusiastically, quote, is something completely sui generis, and the less anthropomorphism or even angelism we introduce in it, the better for theology. The sacraments have a mode of existence of their own, a psychology of their own, a grace of their own. In heaven and earth, there is nothing comparable to sacraments. Close quote. It is when they are exalted and glorified as supreme reality that there can be a progressive alienation from them of theology, ecclesiology, and eschatology, an alienation which, whether it is understood or not, is at the origin of today's crisis, the source and the poison of quote-unquote secularism. As means of individual piety and sanctification, they preserved all their value, quote-unquote, as Catholic acts of the Church fulfilling herself as symbols in, quote-unquote, this world of, quote, the world to come, of the consummation in God of all things. They were simply forgotten. And there's a few more pages. I'll leave it for part 2. Let me know what you guys think. I'll read the rest to close it out. And I hope to be with you again soon. And until next time, God bless.